this Zoom call. So thank you, Dave. And next up is Dr. Dan Kelting. He's the, as you see there, the executive director of the Adirondack Watershed Institute at Paul Smith College in Paul Smith, New York. I'm going to talk about the effects of salting our roads on our water quality and our watershed environment. So thank you, Dan, and it's all yours, please.
Thank you. Hear me okay? Thumbs up?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks, Dave. Good morning, everybody, and greetings from the Adirondacks. It's actually a pretty nice sunny day here, up north. Thanks, Rick, for giving me the opportunity to present at this symposium. I was really impressed by the number of organizations that are involved in protecting the Owasco Lake and the watershed surrounding. It's really quite impressive to see that list of organizations. And John, I really enjoyed your presentation. It's just amazing. It's amazing to see the amount of work that you're doing to really understand what's happening with the Owasco Lake with respect to water quality. It's just amazing, all the different technology sensors out there, all the data that you shared. I think you're really, with that, you're kind of a tough act to follow, because my presentation, I think, is a little bit simpler in that regard. So I was originally going to give a more of a larger talk about salinization of surface lakes and streams and groundwater resources here in the Adirondacks, and then tie that into the state. But I decided, I guess, sort of at the last minute, to really just to focus in on road salting and drinking water, specifically private wells, which is really a statewide issue. Our work that you'll see that I'll present from the Adirondacks will show clearly in this region that road salting has resulted in widespread contamination of our groundwater resources, which really, depending on the levels of salinization, could be a real human health crisis. And this practice, of course, isn't just happening in the Adirondacks; it's happening statewide. So I plan to share the results of our work in Adirondacks, and then I'm going to actually just have one slide that I brought in the Owasco Lake watershed, and to talk a little bit about what the potential is for the same occurrence to be happening within the Owasco Lake watershed. So I guess looking at the theme of this symposium, human factors affecting water quality in Owasco Lake, I'm expanding that theme to be considering human factors affecting groundwater quality in the Owasco Lake watersheds. So just a little bit of an expansion there. So let's go. So just to ground everybody, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Adirondacks. So there I am up there at Paul Smith in the Northern Adirondacks. We're sure all down there in the Finger Lakes. So we're about 4 hours apart driving wise. And just some key statistics to bear in mind with respect to the Adirondacks. We're about 6 million acres in size. It's an area a little bit larger than the Finger Lakes region. We're a 50-50 mix of public and private lands, and that public land is all protected. It's all forest preserve protected under the Forever Wild Clause. And unlike the Finger Lakes, where John showed the land use distributions down there, unlike the Finger Lakes, where you're about 50% agricultural lands, we're 97% forested, and most of that forest is protected, either directly through the Constitution, state lands, or actually managed forest lands that are under conservation easement. So we're very much different in terms of our land use, which is for us quite beneficial in terms of protecting our water quality. Certainly, we do have issues. We do have water quality issues of the type that John was describing, but they are more rare up here than down there, and that has a lot to do with our land use being predominantly forest. We have a lot of lakes and ponds, 11,000 lakes and ponds, And we're pretty light in terms of people that live up here, 135,000 year-round residents. That, of course, that tops over 1 million visitors. We're very much a tourist-based economy. So we don't have a lot of people that live here year-round. That would be a pretty direct contrast to your area, of course, where the population is much larger down the Finger Lakes area. So we don't have a lot in common in terms of these kind of key statistics, but what we do have in common is one thing, at least one thing, and that's salt. So here's a New York State Department of Transportation salt truck. If you've ever been to Tupper Lake, this is actually in Tupper Lake. Salt doing a anti-icing, so putting salt on the road before a snow or ice event. So that happens in the Adirondacks, and this happens down on the Finger Lake. So here's a salt truck salting in the Finger Lakes region. So we have salt as our common connector in terms of a concern related to our water resources in both the Adirondacks and the Finger Lakes, and of course, across the state of New York. So I want to start by getting us all on the same page, if you will, in terms of when we talk about road salt, what are we talking about specifically? And road salt, and you may actually, given your location down there, you may be quite familiar with this substance because a lot of it comes from there. So it's a halite. It's halite. It's a naturally occurring mineral. Its chemical formula is sodium chloride, and it's Na for sodium, Cl for chloride. It's the same salt we buy in the store. So if you go for the Morton salt or the off-brand version, maybe Best Buy, or this is the same salt we put on our food, minus the iodine that they add as an additive. So we're all familiar with salt, as most of us have sort of a love affair with salt. I do. I put way too much salt on my food. So it's the same material that we use on our food. So we're quite familiar with it. It's mined. And you all know the story probably better than I do, being where you are. The largest salt mines in North America are actually down in your region. If you're from Syracuse, and if your family were there for generations, you probably remember the Syracuse is a salt city, and Syracuse University, before they were the Orangemen, were the Saltine Warriors. So just to acknowledge how salt has been such an important part of the economy and folks' livelihood in that part of New York. So it's mined out of the ground. And if you go to your hardware store, you can buy it, and often it's just marketed as halite, which is what it is. And as it claims on the bag, it melts ice and snow. So what happens is as the salt is added, if it's added to the ground where there's snow and ice already, it's going to dissolve, and then it's going to also dissolve break up the snow and ice, resulting in sodium ions, chloride ions, dissolved in water. And when we refer to the term salinization, what we mean by that is the increase in the amounts and the concentrations of sodium and chloride ions in water. So that's what salinization refers to. Why do we use this product? Well, it's cheap, in quotes. It's cheap because it's the only naturally occurring de-icing or anti-icing chemical that's out there. I mentioned it's mined out of the ground. Others are manufactured. Whenever you have to manufacture something, it's going to be more expensive. It's also effective in terms of what it's designed to do. It does melt ice and snow. However, it only works. Its effectiveness really drops precipitously below 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that temperature, you have to start to double or triple the actual rate of application rates to get the same effect in terms of melting. So its effectiveness drops off rapidly with cold temperatures, and we get cold temperatures, as you all know. Cheap, I have that in quotes because when we think about the impacts, certainly on our vehicles, most of us have had to replace perhaps an exhaust system from time or two, or brakes, or I have 3 rusty cars, because of salt. Infrastructure impacts, guardrails, bridges, you name it. There's a lot of impacts, and then the environmental impacts, human health impacts. So when we start to think about it being cheap in terms of purchase costs, it's infrastructure, human health, environmental impacts maybe make it not so cheap. So looking specifically at the Adirondacks, we have shown up, so there's the Adirondack Bath, and those lines on there, the red lines represent our state road network. So these are the roads, so our Route 3s, our Route 30s, we have state US Route 9, and the Northway runs through the Adirondacks. These are all roads that are under the jurisdiction of the New York State Department of Transportation. So the state DOT is responsible for that road network. And all the little black lines, those are the local roads in the Adirondacks. So those are under the jurisdiction of our various municipalities. So they're county roads, town roads, and what are referred to as local roads. All told, there are 10,555 lane miles of paved roads in the Adirondacks that are managed in winter. And if you're not familiar with the term lane mile, so 1 mile of a two-lane road would have 2 lane miles. And think about you're driving a salt truck, you're going to go up 1 mile and back 1 mile. So 1 mile of road has 2 lane miles. That in the Adirondacks, it roughly divides into 25% of the total lane miles are state roads at 2,830 lane miles, and the remaining 75% roughly, or 7,725 lane miles constitute the local road network, which again is under the local road network is under the jurisdiction of, we actually have 105 different municipalities, so 105 different jurisdictions versus the state road network is all under one jurisdiction. On an annual basis, this network receives just under 193,000 tons of road salt per year, or per winter rather. And this breaks down to just over 80,000 tons being applied to the 7,725 lane mile local road network, and about 110,000 tons of salt being applied to the 2,830 lane mile, so the state road network. If we take the tonnage and divide it into lane miles, that gives us the actual load per lane mile. And if we do that, we see the tons of salt and load per lane mile. For the local road network, it's about just over 10, or say about 11 tons of salt per lane mile applied to the local road network, and about 38 tons of salt are applied to the state road network. So we see that the state uses about 2.5 times more salt per lane mile on its road network than the local municipalities do. The reason for this is the state roads, you can see those are literally the arteries of the Adirondacks. So those are the highways that connect our communities, and they connect the Adirondacks to the outside world. Meaning that these are our high-speed, high-traffic roads. They're our main routes for commerce and main routes for travel and tourism. So these roads are maintained at what's called the highest level of service, meaning by legislation, the DOT is mandated to have these roads meet certain criteria in terms of drivability very quickly after snow and ice events. And so to meet that expectation, the state uses high application rates of road salt to get these roads in the drivable condition. And actually the state of New York uses some of the highest road salt application rates in the country. Unlike the state roads, the local road network, these roads are maintained a whole range of levels of service, a whole range of speed limits from anywhere from 30 miles an hour to 55 miles an hour. So the reason why that's important is that because they're maintained at different levels of service, that they actually are treated differently. So in the Adirondacks, many of our local roads are just plowed and sanded. Actually, some are just plowed, and then some are plowed and sanded. And the sand always has a percentage of salt in it, maybe 5 to 10%, and actually helps keep the sand from clumping together. And some of our local roads are actually salted, much like the state roads are. So there's a wide variety of how the local roads are treated in the winter, from no salt to salt, versus all the state roads in the Adirondacks are treated the same in terms of the salt. This difference in how the road networks are treated in the Adirondacks plays a role in understanding the data or the results I'll show you with respect to groundwater, the effects of road salting on our groundwater resources here in the park in a little bit. So the process of salinization of both our surface and groundwater begins with runoff. So here we have a section of road. This is State Route 30, which is just north of Paul Smith College, heading up north towards Malone. And you're looking at about a mile, roughly a mile of stretch of road. And so this 1 mile that you see here would get about 70 tons of salt every winter. And of course, it's not sitting on the road, right? I make it kind of hard to drive on. So it runs off. And so here we're looking at a typical runoff, spring runoff event. You've all witnessed these. You've had this meltwater coming off the road and moving down slope. And we have to sample this particular event when we were out there and ran it through our lab. And so this was March 12th, 2015, just so about 7 years ago, not quite to the day, a week or so ago. And this particular runoff water had 5,000 parts per million of chloride, which is a quarter of the concentration of seawater. So that's pretty dramatic if you think about it. This water coming off the road being a quarter of the concentration of seawater, 5,000 parts per million chloride. So where is this water going? Well, in this case, it's in the Osgood River watershed. So it's heading towards the Osgood River, and on its way, about half of that runoff will actually make it directly to the streams and into the river. And the other half will infiltrate into the soil, where some of it will be retained in the soil, and the remainder will percolate down into the groundwater. So about half roughly direct runoff, and the remainder will actually get down into the ground. So this is happening park wide. So in the Adirondacks, so 193,000 roughly tons of salt runoff per year. Half of that going to surface water, and the other half roughly going down into our soils and the groundwater. In the Adirondacks, widespread use of road salting began in 1980. So our second Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, there was a sort of a clear roads policy came into effect. Before that, most of the roads up here were just plowed and sanded. And I'd be curious to know the history of salting and the magnitude of salting down in the Finger Lakes, because I don't know it. But so if we take 1980 as our start year for widespread use of salting, we can estimate that about 7.7 million tons of salt have been applied to the road network in the Adirondacks since 1980. And so that's kind of a hard number to wrap your mind around, or at least it is for me. So I like to try to put this in terms that we could perhaps understand. So this would equate to 68,750 rail cars full of salt, which would be a train that would stretch from Paul Smith College, where I am now, all the way down to Blacksburg, Virginia, where I went to graduate school at Virginia Tech. So that would be a 760-mile long train. If that train is going 76 miles an hour, you'd be standing there 10 hours in one spot to watch that train roll by you with those 68,750 railroad cars full of salt. So that has a lot of material. And actually the train goes by the Finger Lakes. So I think hopefully this puts a little scale, a little bit of an image in your mind of just how much material that we're talking about over the last 40 years that's been applied to the road network in the Adirondack. And again, half runoff surface and the other half getting into our soils and the groundwater. And the same phenomenon is not unique to the Adirondacks. It's happening throughout the state of New York. So what about groundwater? What about groundwater pollution by road salt? So this map is showing you the unconfined aquifers. So I guess that's sort of orange. The orange color on the map, or the shapes, that is the 1 in 250,000 scale. So very rough scale, unconfined aquifer map for the Adirondacks. Data from the Adirondack Park Agency is where I got this from, their GIS data set. And so these are aquifers, but being unconfined by definition, they're freely acting with the soil above. So water can freely percolate down from the surface soil down into these aquifers and recharge them without any impediment. So there's no impermeable barriers between the surface soils and these groundwater aquifers, preventing the soil water from getting down in. So Many of these aquifers are overlain. You can see, I also put the road network on here. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see that the red lines and black lines do overlay a lot of these orange areas. So many of them then are receiving runoff from paved roads. I just want to zoom in. We'll just zoom into one area so you can see more what I'm talking about here. And so we're looking at sort of in the middle of the Adirondacks, Long Lake. Many of you are probably familiar with Long Lake area, beautiful location in the Adirondacks. And back in 2015, I published a paper with a colleague of mine, Sean Regalado, in one of our peer-reviewed journals. We developed a model, a GIS, a Geographic Information Systems-based model that uses topography to basically route runoff off of paved roads, so we can see where the runoff is going, both in terms of the ground and also what ground it covers and also what waters it gets into. And so what you're looking at here in this zoom in is a few things. First, the unconfined aquifer is shown here in sort of this light tannish color. You can see the red lines. These are the state highways. The black lines, these are the local roads. The pink area, that's the runoff that we estimated coming in our paper from the state road runoff, and the gray area is the runoff being generated from the local road network. So you can see wherever there is an overlay where you have the runoff overlapping or overlaying the unconfined aquifer, you have the potential for that runoff, if it has salt in it, to be infiltrating and percolating down through the soil and then contaminating people's groundwater. So the potential there exists. So what we did over the course of back up. So do we have regional groundwater pollution in the Adirondacks? If we do, the impacts are quite significant. First, we think about impacts to human health, which I'll talk about. Certainly impacts to homeowners, which I'll talk about. And of course, if your water is contaminated, your well water is contaminated, that's going to impact the value of your property for future homeowners who may not be interested in purchasing your property if they can't drink the water that's coming out of the ground. So profound potential impacts. So to answer this question, what we did is we did a private drinking water well study where we actually, over the course of a couple of summers, recruited private homeowners throughout the Adirondacks to participate in our study. What we did is we sent out, us and a number of organizations sent out email blasts through various listservs. We also sent postcards to rural residents throughout the Adirondacks, asking them to participate, and what they got in return to participate was a free test of their well. So we sent them a water bottle when they said they wanted to participate. They filled out a survey, answered a bunch of questions about their well, and we did the lab work, and then we sent them an interpretive report. So that's what they got for participation. So what we ended up with is we had 529 private wells or private residents throughout the Adirondacks that participated in the study, and we assigned those wells into one of three different groupings. The first grouping was 213 wells were upslope and away from paved roads. They did not receive any road runoff. We had 143 wells that were downslope of local roads, so receiving local road runoff. And we had 173 wells that were downslope of state roads, receiving state road runoff. And the way that we did this assignment is we used the model that I talked about in the last slide to basically assign the wells. So in this example here, you can see all the white area is upslope from roads, so that there's no road runoff. So any wells in that area would have been assigned none. Any wells that are on top of the pink runoff area were assigned state road runoff. Any wells, in this case, this one, overlaying the gray area of the local road runoff were assigned local. So that's how we did the assigning. And here's the distribution. So we had, so those 529 wells were quite well distributed across the Adirondacks. Now, that was our goal, to get at the question of regional contamination. We wanted to have as widespread participation geographically as we could, and we did achieve that pretty well across the Adirondacks. So a couple of results. I'm going to show you first the median sodium and chloride ion concentrations. This will be in milligrams per liter for each of these three different classes of wells. First, we'll take a look at sodium concentration. And so we're looking at, again, road runoff by type. So no road runoff, local road runoff, and state road runoff. The height of the bar is the median, and then these verticals are 95% confidence intervals on the medians for each of these. So first, when we look at the sodium concentration for wells that aren't receiving any road runoff, the median concentration is 3 milligrams per liter. The median concentration for wells receiving local road runoff was 6 milligrams per liter, or so that was double the median concentration for wells not receiving road runoff. And the median concentration for wells receiving state road runoff was 33, or 10-fold higher concentration compared to wells not receiving any road runoff. Looking at chloride, we see the median concentration for chloride in wells not receiving any road runoff was less than 1 milligram per liter, which is consistent with if I showed you data from lakes, from streams, in watersheds with no paved roads. So the concentrations of chloride we see in those particular environments in the Adirondacks are usually less than 1 milligram per liter, because in our geology, our granitic geology is just it's not devoid. We do have chloride, but we have very few natural sources of chloride in the Adirondacks. So inherently, our waters, both surface and groundwater, have very low levels of chloride. The local road network, the wells receiving local road runoff, the median concentration was 8 milligrams per liter, and so significantly higher. And the median concentration for wells receiving state road runoff was 100. So over 100 times higher, about 100 times higher than the median concentration for wells not receiving any road runoff. So that's not only statistically significant, that's the magnitude, that effect size is I would say dramatically significant. So why do we have this result? It goes back to first we see the evidence of contamination by salt. But why do we see this pattern in terms of the local roads having higher concentrations of sodium chloride than the wells not receiving road runoff, but not as high as the state? It goes back to what I mentioned earlier about how these roads are treated in the wintertime. All the state highways in the Adirondacks receive high application rates of road salt through the winters versus the local road network. Some do receive salt, but many do not. So we see that difference in the loadings of salt on the networks reflected in the concentrations here, with the state having higher loads, more salt, local much lower loads, much lower salt, and the none the lowest. Having said that, we do have some of our local roads do receive significant amounts of salt, so we do see that reflected in our maximum. So here you're looking in parentheses for both sodium and chloride above each of the bars. The maximum concentrations of sodium and chloride that were observed for each of these types. So the maximum sodium concentration we observed for wells upslope and away from paved roads was 17. The maximum sodium concentration for wells located downslope of local roads was 403 milligrams per liter. So that clearly indicates a lot of salt going into some wells. So those would be associated with local roads that are salted. The maximum sodium concentration for state was almost 2,000 milligrams per liter, so very high. Looking at chloride, maximum 64, 390, and 680s, or 1,680s. So again, so some of the local roads do have higher levels, and that's reflecting that some of them in fact are salted like the state roads. So what are the sort of the implications or significance of these results? So first one relates, or a lot of them actually relate to human health. So New York State Department of Health has a guidance value for sodium for folks on sodium restricted diets. So maybe you have hypertension issues and you've been put on a restricted diet. There's a threshold of 20 milligrams per liter And you can see here that that the median for state roads, the median concentrations of 33 milligrams per liter exceeds the guidance value. So the majority, or over 50%, actually over 65% of the wells that we sampled downslope of state roads exceeded this guidance value for folks that are on sodium restricted diet. So that's a direct concern for individuals who may, unbeknownst to themselves, because you wouldn't necessarily taste the sodium in the water, even though it's exceeding this threshold. So unbeknownst to themselves, they may be getting too much sodium into their diet than they're actually supposed to. Thinking about chloride, there is a guidance value for chloride, and it's set at 230 milligrams per liter for drinking water. But that guidance value is not based on health, it's based on aesthetics. So it is meaning that getting above chloride concentrations in drinking water, getting above 230 milligrams per liter, it's taste. People don't like the taste of that much chloride in their water. But that is not really the issue with chloride. The issue with chloride has to do with its role in corrosion. It's very corrosive. So meaning that if you have corrosive well water, it causes corrosion to hot water heaters, dishwashers, plumbing. So folks that have salty water, salty wells are frequently replacing their dishwashers, or frequently having to replace their hot water heater. They get broken pipes, pipe fittings, and actually the corrosion of the interior of pipes, depending on the age of the pipes in the house, can end up releasing metals, heavy metals like lead, into your drinking water. So it's a direct concern related to human health. The best example of that doesn't come from the Adirondacks. The best example of that comes from Flint, Michigan, and you all are probably familiar with the story. So it was a cover of Time magazine a number of years ago. So Flint, Michigan, of course, a city that's been in dire straits financially for a long time, used to, before the lead crisis happened, used to get its drinking water from the city of Detroit. The administrators of Flint decided, as a cost-cutting measure, to stop paying Detroit for their drinking water, and decided to source their drinking water from the Flint River. And so they switched to the Flint River to get their drinking water. But what they failed to do when they made that switch is they didn't test that drinking water source, the Flint River, for chloride. So they didn't test it for chloride. And it turned out that the chloride concentrations in the Flint River were high enough to cause corrosion of the pipes, of all the water supply lines, which, as you know, if you follow the story, are lead-lined pipes. And so that corrosion of those pipes ended up releasing a lot of lead in the drinking water system in Flint. And where did that that chloride come from that is in the Flint River? It came from road salt. So this is a dramatic example of how road salt has, in a sad story, because they didn't test it, and they actually could have prevented it if they had tested it. But a sad story and a striking example of how road salt and chloride, the corrosivity of chloride has resulted in major implications for human health. In this case, in the case of Flint, Michigan, related to lead. So what we did is to look at corrosivity of the well water in the Adirondacks. We used it's called the Larson-Scold Index, which is a corrosivity index based on the molar ratio of chloride and sulfate over alkalinity. So it's a calculation based on chloride, sulfate, and alkalinity, which we measured in all our samples. So I'm going to show you the percentage of wells sampled that were determined to be non-corrosive based on this index, corrosive and highly corrosive, again, by road type. So when we do this, we see that 95% of the wells that were upslope and away from paved roads, not receiving any road runoff, had non-corrosive water. just over 70% of the wells that were downslope of local roads receiving local road runoff had non-corrosive water. And for state, we see that only just about 30% of the wells that were downslope of state roads had non-corrosive water, meaning that the delta, the difference, means that the rest were corrosive. Looking at the remainder, we see that some of the wells that are upslope and away from paved roads have naturally corrosive water. 10% roughly of the local roads, wells receiving local road runoff had corrosive water, and just under 10, or about 8% of the wells receiving state road runoff had corrosive water. Most of the wells receiving state road runoff had highly corrosive water, and so about 20% of the wells receiving local road runoff had highly corrosive water, and about 2% of the wells receiving no road runoff had highly corrosive water. So when we think about this, the implications of this are quite significant. The Adirondacks have about, based on data I was able to obtain from the Office of Real Properties for 2020, about 55,000 private homes in the Adirondack region that are on wells, so they're drawing their own water from their own wells in the ground. Of these 55,000 homes, 40,000 of them were built, they're old. We have old housing stock, and you may too. 40,000 of these homes were built before the Lead-Free Act, which was passed in 1986. So meaning that they have plumbing, they have other fixtures in their home that would contain lead and other heavy metals. Of these 40,000 wells that would contain lead, 12,000 of them, by virtue of their location being downslope of state highways and receiving state road runoff, and some of them being downslope of local roads and receiving local road runoff, may have highly corrosive water. So we're talking about a potential real crisis in the region related to combination of older homes with old plumbing that contains lead and other fixtures that contain lead, and corrosive water by virtue of salting. And this is certainly by no means an Adirondack issue alone, because as I said at the beginning, one thing that we have in common with the Finger Lakes is we also use salt, and a lot of that salt ends up in the ground and in groundwater. So potentially a major crisis. So I want to end with a little bit about Owasco Lake. So you all know it better than I do, certainly. But so there's the watershed and the lake itself. And I just want to show some simple data looking at salinization indicators. Again, salinization referring in this case to the increase in sodium and chloride ion concentrations. And so we'll just look at connectivity in microsiemens per centimeter and the chloride in milligrams per liter. And I was able to dig back to 1962. So the U.S. Geological Survey actually did sample the lake back in 1962. So it's a nice data point. I was -3 years old, and I was yet to be born. I was born in 1965, so I wasn't around. So back then, conductivity is 253 microsiemens per centimeter, and the chloride concentration in the lake was 4.8 milligrams per liter. Dial it up to 2020. I looked in the CSLAP report from 2020, and so the average the median values for conductivity was 295, so it was up 16% from 1962, and the CSLAP report itself said that the trend in conductivity has been increasing over time, so it's increasing. The chloride concentration in 2020 in Owasco Lake is 24 milligrams per liter, which is about 400%, so 4 times higher than it was in 1962. So quite a large increase over time. So in some ways it's alarming in terms of the magnitude of the increase, but it's still, in terms of thinking about, so John was talking about, eutrophic indicators and harmful algal blooms and those things. In terms of the concentration of chloride in Owasco Lake, that's still quite low, even though it's disturbing to see it going up. It's still quite a low number, and certainly below any thresholds that I've seen related to potential impacts on the ecosystem that aquatic ecosystem. So it's higher and it's trending up, and certainly will continue to go up, but it hasn't crossed any thresholds. Here, what I'm going to do here is take these concentrations of chloride and scale them to the lake, just based on the volume, lake volume that I pulled out of the Owasco Lake Watershed Management Plan. I just scaled the chloride to metric tons in the lake at these different time points. So back in 1960, at a concentration of 4.8 milligrams per liter, the lake would have had about 3,500 metric tons of chloride in it at that time. In 2020, if we use 24, the lake would have about 18,000 metric tons of chloride in it at that time. Looking at the number of miles, lane miles of paved roads in your watershed, so the red lines, these are the state highways, and the gray, sort of the grayed out ones are the local roads. Totaling up that whole lane miles and making some assumptions in terms of without prior knowledge, but just by local knowledge here, about how much salt would be applied per lane mile. I estimate about 35,000 metric tons would be applied to your roads as chloride in 2020 and basically every year. So if you think about that, the delta between what's in the lake and what's applied is about just under 17,000 tons. And this would roughly, these are sort of back of the envelope calculations I love to do and get in trouble for, but roughly half of the salt, which rings certainly consistent with our work in the Adirondacks and others who have published on this topic, about half of the salt that's applied would be retained in the watershed, and where, again, in the soil and down into groundwater. Now, I don't have any data from your watershed on any wells, but the only data I do have is the number of wells that have been drilled so this is from the DEC, who started keeping records of wells drilled since 2002. And based on that data, I clipped out about 565 new wells have been drilled in your watershed. So these are private homeowner wells since 2002. You can see they're associated. There's always a road near a well, whether they be upslope or downslope is the question. So there's a risk. I think so in addition to thinking about the lake and certainly the health of your aquatic ecosystem, and certainly you pull drinking water, I know from the lake for the city of Auburn and I believe other places. But a lot of the residents in your watershed are drawing their own water from the ground. And so I think based on what we've learned here in the Adirondacks, there's no reason to believe that things would be any different or better in your region in terms of what's happening in terms of salt getting into groundwater. And I really wanted to so my story to you is I would really urge, if it hasn't been thought of, it hasn't been done, to start to really think about assessing the impacts of salt on the groundwater resources in the Owasco Lake watershed. So I'll wrap up here. So what road salt from our findings has resulted in widespread groundwater pollution throughout the Adirondack Park. And again, there's no reason to believe that this isn't happening in the Finger Lakes region. There was actually a great report came out of the Carey Institute in Dutchess County that had similar findings as the Adirondacks. The groundwater located downslope from state roads is most polluted in the Adirondacks. That may or may not be the case where you live. It depends on how the local roads are treated. Many private wells are exceeding the sodium guideline and may have highly corrosive water. And really the take home from this is that corrosive water causes damage, so that's a pocketbook issue, and it may be leaching lead in older homes and pose a risk for human health. So I will leave it at that and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dan. That's very interesting information. I had a couple of questions. One was curious about this. Who supplies the salt for your Adirondacks? It's specifically, is that Cargill? Yeah,
most of it. Yeah. So most of, and probably the same through both the state and local municipalities. They get they get contracts through the I'm blanking on the term, but there's a state agency that handles big contracts for salt purchases. But yeah, a lot of it comes through Cargill, and I guess it's American Rock Salt, I believe. Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier about vegetarians' ability to take up salt reducing the vegetation's ability to take up HAB supporting nutrients. Do you know any? It's concern for salt reducing vegetation's ability to take up HAB supporting nutrients.
I guess I don't understand that question.
I think does salt affect plants' ability?
Oh, sure, yeah. So absolutely. So the fact that there's two effects on plants. One is direct. There's direct contact. So salt spray on conifers is basically a contact herbicide. So you see the browning of needles for conifers that are on the side of roads. That's salt spray. So that's a direct impact. The other impact is the salt in the ground. So it causes osmotic stress. So basically, the roots are in competition with the salt. The salt, sodium chloride ions are attracting the water and actually making those creating an osmotic stress for the plants. So they're basically water starved. So there's another impact too. Two other plant impacts. One is if the salt concentration is high enough, it's actually going to disrupt or basically degrade soil structure. So plants need good soil structure, good aeration for good aeration and root growth potential. Salt also, sodium ions also displace essential nutrients like calcium, magnesium from exchange. So that can actually decrease the fertility of the soil to support a healthy plants. So there are a number of impacts.
Okay, is New York State DOT aware of your study? Are there been any?
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. So I've been involved in studying this and talking about this issue for going on 12 years. I've had a number of meetings in Albany with the DOT commissioner, the DEC commissioner, the governor's office. I've been serving on a grassroots group for that whole time, advocating for change. And what has happened from that is our local our legislator Billy Jones and also local Senator Dan Steck sponsored legislation to form that the Governor Hochul, actually Governor Cuomo signed when he was still governor, to form an Adirondack Road Salt Task Force. And Governor Hochul, when she came into office, she appointed the committee members to that task force. I'm one of those committee members. So I'm a member of the governor's task force working on road salt reduction in the Adirondacks. And so our charge as a task force is to look at alternatives to be able to have, we want safe roads, right? There's a challenge here, right? So people want to be able to drive in the wintertime. Unfortunately, they want to be able to drive 65 miles an hour. But people we need our roads to be safe, but we also want to protect our environment and our health. So this task force is charged. It's sort of a daunting task. We're trying to figure out ways that we can have safe roads in a healthy environment. And so we just started meeting. Literally 2 weeks ago. And I'm the chair of there's a subgroup called the Salt Impact Subgroup. So the data that I just showed you is part of the data that we'll be putting into our report. And we're hoping that the findings of the recommendations of this task force will not just be, again, this isn't just an Adirondack issue, that these recommendations will be considered for the state. And that's sort of our goal.
I need to get to, we have 3 more presentations. So there's a couple more questions. I would direct those folks to contact you directly for answers to those questions. Okay.
Yep.
Sorry for but
nope.
We need to move on. I appreciate it's a very interesting topic and more to be developed, But,
you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Can I, our